Hi, and welcome to this session on running QlikView in SaaS. My name is Marcus Spitzmiller, and I'm a director within the global pre-sales team here at Qlik. Let's get started. So the purpose of this session today is to talk about QlikView and how you can leverage your QlikView assets that you've developed in Qlik's SaaS environment. And we'll talk about it from the standpoint of leveraging your Qlik assets and then also migrating those Qlik assets. And there's several points to consider as you think about that journey. And so to cover that journey, we'll talk about it through this agenda. And the first thing that we'll talk about is QlikView apps in SaaS and what it looks like to run your QlikView apps directly in SaaS. We'll talk about the function of QlikView Publisher in the SaaS environment. And then, of course, there's things to consider as you think about how you leverage these assets in SaaS, whether it's a migration or kind of a lift and shift. And those topics include security, governance, and then we'll talk about an actual migration and what that looks like. And then finally, we'll talk about some information around the Analytics Modernization Program. As we're getting started, just real quick, if you would like to see this in action with your own QlikView application, it's real easy to come to this trial page. Just go to Google, search for Qlik Trial. You'll be taken to this page. You can fill out your information, and within a minute or two, you will have a trial tenant where you can load your own QlikView document and see this in action for yourself. Okay, so let's start by looking at QlikView apps in SaaS. Okay, so here we are in my tenant, and I'm going to log in right now. And I won't take you through this whole hub interface because there is a separate session on that. But I will say that you can see here in the hub I've got kind of a welcome page, which I'll close up for now. You can see we've got sample data loaded up. I have some QlikSense apps. And let's look at how simple it is to load a QlikView document into. So I'm going to choose Add New, Upload an App, and then I have a file right here that I will drag in, and we'll hit Upload. I'm going to leave it in my personal space right now. We'll talk about spaces a little bit later, and we'll hit Upload. Okay, there it is, and we can see my app here with the QVW extension. We'll upload it, or we'll open it. And sure enough, the QlikView experience is here, and the user interface that you are used to seeing is here and completely interactive. The top bar is the same. All the navigation is the same. So generally, we're looking at our QlikView application running in the SaaS platform. So that was a short demo, and now what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about feature compatibility, as this is obviously an important topic and will inform which applications would be candidates to run in SaaS, which would be candidates to maybe migrate to QlikSense applications, or which are candidates to leave behind. And first, I'll call out that the IE plugin ActiveX Control for Internet Explorer actually runs in SaaS. And for various reasons, many Qlik customers enjoy using this plugin still to this day, predominantly for the user experience and the ability to control the deployment into a large organization. And while there are a lot of supported features for QlikView, there are some unsupported features as well. And I've listed kind of at a high level the kind of categories of unsupported features. You can see below, and in the Qlik Help Guide, there is a full listing of all of the compatibility, so I'd encourage you to look that up if you're interested. But generally speaking, the objects that are having to do with collaboration or notes or shared objects or creating objects, as we discussed, are read-only and unsupported. It's not possible to run or create the PDF reports within a QlikView document, nor is it possible to connect QlikView application in SaaS to Qlik End Printing. And then from like a user interface standpoint, things like input fields are unsupported, macros have limited support, and then aside from geoanalytics, the server-side extensions and third-party extensions would be unsupported as well. So as you're thinking about your applications, this is something to consider in terms of those applications that would be candidates for the SaaS platform, or maybe migrated to Qlik Sense apps, where a lot of this functionality is actually replicated in terms of shared objects and collaboration and notes, and those things are more inherent to the Sense experience. And similarly, reporting, there's a rich roadmap of capabilities beginning to come online, and will continue through 2021 and 2022. Now, one thing that's important to consider is that while the ClickView applications can be loaded into the SaaS environment, as I just showed, and they're interactive, as I just showed, it's not possible to author ClickView applications directly in SaaS, nor is it possible to reload them directly in SaaS. It isn't possible to import and export them, and this is kind of contrasted with the QlikSense applications, where the full life cycle is possible in terms of authoring and reloading and consuming and so on. And so this distinction is something that's obviously important and will inform the remainder of this discussion as it pertains to architecture and migration. So let's look at what role QlikView Publisher has to play then with SaaS. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the components of the QlikView on-premise product, there's really kind of two main components. One is called the QlikView server, and that's not pictured in this diagram, but it's really the analytic engine. It's the thing that takes the QlikView applications and displays them and performs all the associative analytics, and your users connect to that for your analytics currently. And then the other component is the QlikView Publisher, and this is really responsible for querying your on-premise data sources and really assembling the application itself. And in an on-premise world, then QlikView Publisher queries your data sources. It builds that application, it reloads the data into the application, and it performs what we call a distribution. It distributes the document to the QlikView server for users to work with. One of the capabilities of QlikView Publisher is also to publish the QlikView documents directly into the SaaS environment. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. So querying the data sources that you might already have on premise, building that QVW file, the application, publishing it to SaaS. And this is something that can be scheduled, it can be done on a repeated basis, and so those applications that you might already have on premise, rather than distributing them to the on-premise QlikView server, you can point them to SaaS. And let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so I have two tabs open. One of them is my QlikView Management Console. The other one is my SaaS tenant. And I'd like to set up the integration between the two so that we can publish a document to SaaS. In QlikView Management Console, I'm going to come to System, and under Setup, and then there's a folder for cloud deployments, and this folder is available with some of the more recent versions of QlikView. So if you're on a very old version of QlikView, you're going to want to check and see what version is compatible with SaaS. And I'm going to come to the plus sign here and add a cloud deployment. Now, what it's going to ask me for is my tenant URL. So let's go grab that. And then I'll hit apply. And then I'll edit the details. And under the general tab, it is going to allow me to generate a long sequence of strings that I'm going to copy and we're going to use for SaaS. So on the SaaS side of things, I'm going to come to the console. And under Identity Provider, now Identity Provider is where you can hook up your identity provider like Okta or Auth0, some sort of OpenID compatible identity provider for your users to use to authenticate with. But it's also possible to configure what we call a multi-cloud deployment. And so here I'm going to paste in my bearer token, and click on Create. And that's all it takes to set up the integration between the two environments. Now that we have that configured, let's decide on an app to distribute to SaaS. So I'm going to come back to QlikView, and under my Documents tab, I'm going to choose a document. Let's choose the Executive Dashboard. And you may have an existing task associated with this that's doing your reloads and your distributions. You can certainly modify that task to do whatever I am about to show you right now. But I'm going to create a new task. We're going to disable the reload. We don't need to do that right now for this demo. But we will do a distribution. If you're familiar with the Management Console, most of the time you're doing a distribution to the QlikView server, as I mentioned earlier. But it is also possible to distribute to a cloud deployment. Whoops. We're going to click Distribute the Document first. We'll talk about this here a little bit later, but we're going to click on Distribute Document. Then I'm going to choose my cloud deployment and hit Apply. And then after that, we will go ahead and run the task. And we'll come over to the Status tab and watch it go. And now that it's done, we can come check it out in Qlik Sense. Now, one thing that happens, and this is a one-time step, when I come over to my apps, you will see that this app shows up in a staged area. And what that means is we need to allocate that to a space that it will kind of reside for users to access. This is a one-time thing. Subsequent distributions will not require this step. And now if I come back to the hub, we'll see that my executive dashboard is here. And of course I can open it as you might expect. Okay, let's take a look at security next. As you consider moving your users from a on-premise based environment to a SaaS based environment, the nature of some of the security technologies have really changed over time, and so we want to take a look at some of those things to consider. Now, as you start to put users onto the Qlik SaaS environment, certainly they will need to authenticate. Now, in the on-premise world, with QlikView, they are most likely authenticating with Windows Active Directory, sometimes a SAML provider, and they will need to authenticate into the Qlik SaaS environment as well. And there's a couple options for doing that. The first is something that's called Qlik Account, and that's an identity provider that is supplied by Qlik that allows users to authenticate into the SaaS environment. What happens is that they receive an email invitation, and with that they're able to create an account and sign into the tenant. But you should know that from a user experience standpoint, then those users will have two different logins. One for Qlik SaaS, called Qlik Account, and then of course if they're connecting to any applications that are still on the QlikView on-premise environment, they would be signing in through Windows Active Directory. So this is a good kind of first step, and it's also maybe sufficient for smaller environments where you are able to move all of your Qlik applications right away. But this is a good way to get started. Now the second option is, rather than using Qlik's supplied identity provider, you're able to integrate your own identity provider from your organization to the Qlik SaaS environment. Think of Okta, think of Auth0. What the requirement here is a identity provider that adheres to the OpenID standard. And what this allows you to do then is, if you're already using an identity provider that you're familiar with, those users would receive a tile in that identity provider that they would click on, and they would be brought directly into the Qlik SaaS environment. The benefit to this approach is twofold. First, in using this, you're able to leverage your organization's groups as well. So if a user belongs to the sales group or the finance group or what have you, that is passed into the environment, and that can drive access control to your applications. The second one is that the user experience is consistent across in terms of sign-ons. And this is done by setting up what is called the proper claims mapping, and this means that the user's Active Directory user ID is passed into the SaaS environment as well. There's some technicalities around doing this, but it's ultimately achievable. And third, if your QlikView on-premise environment is already integrated with an identity provider, something that uses SAML more than likely, if that identity provider also supports OpenID, then you can of course integrate that with the SaaS environment as well. And this would be the most seamless of the three options in the sense that the user has the same sign-in across all environments and a single identity provider to manage that. What I will say is that if your QlikView on-premise environment doesn't already have this identity provider, it's probably not worth the effort to try to integrate it at this point. I would look at options 1 or 2. And next, let's talk quickly about section access. So if you're unfamiliar with what section access is, this is the means by which we achieve row and column level security within an application, so that a user, when they access that application, only sees the data that they're entitled to. And what this diagram is showing is that there's essentially an entitlement table that is written by a QlikView developer that ties a user or a group of users to some element of the data model here, and this is representing the data model. And then this column for omit is for omitting certain columns in the data model. And so this section access table is something that your developers would be familiar with and helps drive and does drive the visibility for a user or a group of users to the data in an application. And so as you can see, the section access table is highly dependent upon the user ID and the groups to which that user belongs for driving the section access. And so if you can imagine moving an application now to SaaS, we need to ensure that those user IDs and groups still tie out for section access to be enforced. And that's what this table below is showing, that it's possible that these user IDs and groups change. And this is dependent upon the choice of authentication you make as you consider those 3 slides that we just covered a moment ago. If we were to choose Qlik account, for example, then certainly the user IDs change and groups actually aren't supported in Qlik ID. So we have to go through an exercise of remapping your user to the new user ID. If you choose something like authentication option number 2 or number 3, with the right claims mapping, you can ensure that the Active Directory or whatever user ID you're using on-premise flows through to your section access so that you don't have to rework this. But it is possible to rework if you choose to do that as well. And just wanted to call out that section access is certainly a consideration as you move your applications to SaaS. Okay, so we talked about authentication and section access, and now we want to talk about the access control model in the SaaS environment and how you might map what you're doing in QlikView into this new model. So in QlikSaaS, the primary means for grouping and controlling the access of applications is something that we call spaces. Now, actually, spaces are more than just for applications. It can contain data and data connections and all sorts of various assets, but for the purposes of this conversation, we'll focus on the applications themselves. And what spaces are a flexible way of grouping these applications to do things like collaboration or drive application life cycles. And the spaces themselves are governed by different roles, and so you can designate things like space creators and viewers and editors and publishers and administrators. And there are different types of spaces. And the first space we'll look at is something that's called the personal space. Now, as the name implies, every user gets a personal space, and this is an area in which users can do things like sandbox activities or ad hoc activities. Anything that they do in this space is kept to themselves. The second type of space is called a shared space, and this is a good space for things like team development or team collaboration, where an administrator can create a space, or users, if they're given the access, can create this type of space. And then the work that a person or group of people can do inside of this space is collaborative in nature. Multiple people can build visualizations. Multiple people can leverage the data within those spaces, and so on. The third space is something that's called the managed space, and this is the closest space to what you might be familiar with in terms of what QlikView Publisher does. This is a space where the applications that reside in it are more controlled and more governed and read-only. Users can still create self-service visualizations on these applications, but fundamentally the applications are more consume in nature. And then finally there's something that's called a data space, which is dedicated, as the name might apply, to data itself and in governing and storing data and data connections within them. Alright, so let's take a look at QlikView Publisher and see how a common task can be kind of now mapped into SaaS. So I have a market analysis dashboard here and a task associated with it. And if you're any familiar with Publisher, you'd know that it's pretty common to perform a reload of that application, and then under the distribution tab, you would distribute that application to the QlikView server. And under here, it's pretty common to have chosen some named users, and here the flow is that you would search for, your user or your group of users that you wanted to associate with this particular application. And then when that task runs, of course, those users get to see that application. There's another feature that gets used once in a while that you're able to just distribute to a folder on some file share, and then that folder outside of Qlik is given permissions using the operating system. So you can imagine using Windows ACLs, for example, to give the sales group access to the sales folder and the finance group access to the finance folder. These are the two kind of common means for distribution of applications in QlikView. So let's have a look at this app in SaaS now, and if you remember, all I need to do is check this box and choose my cloud deployment because we've got the integration set up already. And while I'm at it, I think I'm going to remove the authorization on the QlikView server itself and then hit apply. And then we'll go ahead and run this task and see what it looks like in SaaS. So now I'm back in SaaS. I'm in the management console, and like last time, under the staged apps, we have our new dashboard, and I would like to set this into the marketing managed space, and we'll click on apply. And then I'll come over to SaaS in my marketing space. Let me refresh my screen, and we should see that the new dashboard is there. And so in terms of managing the access control then, each space has settings in which you can add or manage members of that space. Right now I'm the only member and I'm the owner of this space, but by clicking this button here, I can choose people that I would like to have access to this space, and I can choose the permissions that they would have. So Todd, in this, by checking this, can be a read-only viewer of the applications in this space, or we could change his permissions to be able to create content, self-service content on top of those applications, and people can manage the spaces in terms of membership, and people can be granted the permission to publish apps into this space as well. And if you were to hook up your identity provider to the SaaS tenant, then groups would be visible in this drop-down as well to be able to choose and manage your access at a group level as well. So in terms of migrating the access control from QlikView to SaaS, then that exercise is fairly straightforward in the sense that those applications that have been distributed to a folder, well, that folder is just a space in SaaS, and you can kind of lift that nomenclature and move it into SaaS. For those applications that are managed, individually by distributing to the QlikView server, well, then there's a little bit of work to do in the sense that you need to kind of the access control level in SaaS is at a space level, and so we need to look at the applications that you've distributed and decide how to group them and move those into the appropriate spaces. What I will say to aid in that exercise is, in the QlikView access point, there is such thing as a category, and a lot of customers have chosen to group their applications by these categories anyway. And so these categories here are pretty good candidates for the equivalent spaces in SaaS as well. And so you might look at grouping your applications that way. So up until now, we've talked mostly about your production applications and production users, but certainly as you're considering a move to SaaS, you want to consider your developers and lower environments. and the data that goes along with those applications. And so that's what this section will cover. A common QlikView deployment looks a little bit like this, where there's one or more publishers and there's one or more QlikView servers, and the publisher is querying your on-premise data sources and sometimes even cloud-based data sources. And it's producing applications, but it's also producing QVD data that supply those applications. And then of course your consumers and your authors are all on-premise. And we've discussed the fact that the introduction of the SaaS environment means that publisher now has a new place to land your applications and therefore offload some of your consumption. This means that your QlikView server hardware footprint can be reduced because it's not doing as much work now that SaaS is picking up the load of your consumers. Now certainly you'd like it to move as many applications as possible, to sunset as much hardware as possible, to take advantage of the SaaS environment as greatly as possible. There are a handful of reasons for applications to remain on-premise, one which we've talked about, which is the differences in some of the features at the beginning of the presentation. Another one is the need to keep your QlikView application on-premise to support any sort of end printing requirements that you might have. And the third might be around your application sizes. There is some tiers of application sizes that are permitted inside of SaaS, and those have different costs associated with those, so you're going to want to look at that as well. But fundamentally, you can bring a lot of applications out to SaaS, if not all of them. For those applications that do remain on-premise, it's possible to create a link from SaaS back to the on-premise environment. Now I won't demonstrate this because it's fairly straightforward to imagine, but from an end user standpoint, this means that the applications that are hosted in SaaS and those applications that are on-premise are presented in a single hub, and simply when a user clicks on the linked applications, it takes them back to the access point where the application is opened and run on-premise. And as we start to look at the lower environments, you should know that environments like dev and test and prod and UAT and those types of environments, those can also be configured to push to SaaS as well. And so from a testing standpoint and the hardware that it requires to run your QlikView applications on-premise in those lower environments, that can also be reduced as you can set up spaces for your dev and your test environments as well. So let's turn our attention to the data side of things now. Up until now, we've been talking about applications being pushed into SaaS for your users to consume and your testers to test, but it might also be true that you'd like to have your QVD data available in the environment as well. While there are several options to move data into SaaS, I'd like to point out Qlik Data Transfer, which is a free, lightweight solution for use with the SaaS environment. I point this out because it has the ability to look at the QVD data that your QlikView has produced, and using a folder watcher methodology, look at your QVD folders and upload any QVDs that have been produced or changed into the SaaS environment. And so as you look to introduce authoring into the environment, Qlik Data Transfer then is an easy way to leverage the assets that you've already produced in QlikView and push those into SaaS as well. Many customers use a tiered approach for producing QVDs, meaning an extract tier of QVDs followed by a business tier of QVDs, and I think that the Qlik Data Transfer is a great solution for moving your business layer of QVDs into SaaS so that your developers and power users can now create new Qlik Sense applications based on that data that you produced in QlikView. And last on this topic, and while it's beyond the scope of this presentation to get into a lot of detail, I did want to point out there is a variety of ways to get data into SaaS, not just Qlik Data Transfer. There's many native connectors in the SaaS environment. There's the ability to push data from on-premise in a variety of different ways. There's ways to push apps, which we've talked about a lot. And finally, there's the entire Qlik data integration portfolio. So depending upon where you're at in your journey with QlikView, you may be also looking at modernizing your data integration strategy, and I'd encourage you to look at these different capabilities further as well. In this last section, we'll look at migrating your QlikView applications to Qlik Sense. So until now I have talked about QlikView running in SaaS, but it's also possible to migrate your QlikView applications to Qlik Sense applications as well. And why would you do that? Well, first, the Qlik Sense application stack is more modern in nature, and importantly, and it's no secret, it's also where Qlik is investing its R&D efforts and its development efforts to bring the latest and greatest features for analytics to life. And so moving to Qlik Sense from your QlikView applications gives you the ability then to leverage those new assets for new use cases. So, for example, taking your application which was once consume only and now extending that to a governed self-service use case, or introducing the ability to chat with that dashboard that you had in QlikView. Those are some examples. Further, the QlikView platform is built on some older technologies. Think of IIS, ASPX, and this provides you an opportunity to decouple yourself from some of those legacy technologies, and it also gives you the ability to not have to worry about upgrades of your QlikView hardware or some of the architectural limitations that the platform has. And finally, and importantly, from a development standpoint, it allows you to remove the desktop development dependency. These are just some of the reasons to consider migrating your QlikView applications over to Qlik Sense. And next I wanted to take you through kind of what that looks like. So to get started migrating an application, I'm going to take advantage of a tool that is found in QlikSense Desktop. I mentioned earlier that authoring in SaaS is all over a browser, and that is true. However, this bit of utility is found only in QlikSense Desktop, so I'm going to download that and install that. Okay, so I have QlikSense Desktop installed, and we're going to take a look at this QlikView application. This is an insurance dashboard that has a handful of tabs and is a pretty common representation of a QlikView application. Now I'm going to come over to the QlikView desktop, and up at the top right hand corner choose this menu item called the Dev Hub. And the Dev Hub has several capabilities, but the one that we're interested in here is called the QlikView Converter. And I am going to choose my application here. And as you can see, what it's doing is uploading the document, and it's converting as much of this document as it can for us. The things that it will keep is the load script, the data model, and it will create as many dimensions and measures and visualizations as possible. So you can see here that it's recognizing the content within my application in terms of visualizations. It will create all of these dimensions and measures in my QlikSense app. It recognizes all of the variables, and I guess in this case it didn't convert it. It didn't miss anything. So if I wanted to, I can choose specifically which items I wanted to convert. For the purposes of this demonstration, I will just keep all of the defaults, and I'm going to come over here and click on Create App. And it tells me it's now available in my hub, so let's go check it out. Alright, let's take a look at what came over. First, I'm going to come to the data model viewer here, and as we can see, our application's data model is here and available. And if I come to the load script under the data load editor, we can see that my load script is still here. From a load script standpoint, this is certainly one area that needs to be reviewed, in the sense that maybe you need to point to QVDs that have now been uploaded into SaaS through Qlik Data Transfer or by other means. Maybe you need to re-enter connection information to reload from cloud data sources, and so on and so forth. So this is an area that you would want to have a look at and rationalize. We're not going to do that right now, but let's take a look at the user interface. So I'm going to come back to the app overview, and as you can see, we don't have any sheets yet, but I will create one. And let's take a look at what we have created with the conversion tool. And we can see all of our fields are here. We can see from master items, all of our dimensions are here. We can see all of our measures are here. We can see our visualizations have been created as well. And we can use these now to put together our dashboard. Alright, so with what remaining time we have, I will take you through some elements of the conversion process, and then I think you'll get the idea of what this entails. So the first thing that I want to do is, because there's a very specific kind of styling associated with this document, I've already gone ahead and created a theme that we're going to choose for this document. Now, themes are something that you can find online. You can create those with JSON files. These are extensions that are kind of native to the product, and so with these themes you can use that to create any sort of coloring that you would like. And so I've gone ahead and done that. Okay, so let's build a chart. I'd like to start with this gauge right here for loss ratio. And if I come over to Qlik Sense, I can see that several visualizations have been pre-created for me. And if I click on any of them, I can see a preview of what they are. Now this one looks pretty close. I think this is the one, so I'm going to drag this in here, and we can see that we have some tweaking to do. And so we'll go ahead and do that. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to go through and create a few others. Okay, so the intent here is obviously not to have a complete tutorial on how to convert an app, but I wanted to illustrate that it is straightforward to get to a dashboard that is fairly similar to what is existing in QlikView, and how you're able to reuse the data model, the load script, and the various dimensions and measures and visualizations that you've worked so hard to build in QlikView. One thing that I didn't cover is the ability to automate your dashboard in the same way that you are with QlikView. If you're familiar with actions, those are available in Qlik Sense. And using the Qlik Dashboard bundle, you'll see that there are various controls available to you, like a date picker or a variable input control that allows you to choose buttons and drop downs and input boxes and sliders and things like that to really provide that guided experience that your dashboard might have in QlikView. Okay, and one last little bonus. I have imported the application we've created into SaaS, and I mentioned before the ability to take the assets that you have in QlikView and open those up to new use cases, and I'd like to demonstrate that really quickly by using the Insight Advisor. I've enabled the insurance app to be used by the Insight Advisor, and now I can do things like this. And we can see now that the QlikView application that's been converted over to Qlik Sense has opened up new use cases, in this case natural language, for your users to leverage your QlikView assets in new and exciting ways. And last, I wanted to touch on the Qlik Analytics Modernization Program. Now, throughout this presentation, you've heard me talk about various technical elements in terms of how to reuse your QlikView, how to move it to SaaS, how to migrate it, and so forth. And the Qlik Analytics Modernization Program provides you the commercial route to do so. So if you are at all interested in what I showed today or modernizing your data analytics strategy, I would encourage you to look this up and also contact your local sales rep or partner that you work with to learn more. Thanks, and have a great day.